October 1968. One phone call. Lee Radziwill, one of the most celebrated women in the world, a princess by marriage, intimate of presidents, the woman Truman Capote called his most extraordinary swan, lifted the receiver. Aristotle Onassis was on the line. The man she had loved since 1962. The man she had introduced to her sister. The man she had quietly stepped aside for, never asked to step aside, and never openly acknowledged stepping aside for. He was calling to tell her he was marrying Jackie Kennedy. Not Jackie calling him. Here is what everyone in Lee's world already knew and nobody had said out loud. Lee Radziwill had been the one to bring them together. She arranged the yacht cruise in 1963. She made the introduction. She handed Jackie the man she herself was in love with, and then watched for 5 years, while her sister moved into the space Lee had cleared. Lee called Truman Capote the moment she hung up. She was weeping. The only question she could form through the tears was, how could she? How could this happen? Nobody answered her. Nobody had ever asked what it cost her. For years, nobody asked. This is what lived in that silence. Nobody asked. Old Money Wives asks. Subscribe so the silence is never permanent again. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed before the loss took hold. Caroline Lee Bouvier was born March 3, 1933, in Southampton, New York, 18 months after her sister Jacqueline. That gap, 18 months. It defined the entire architecture of what followed. Not because Lee was lesser. She was not, by any honest measure, lesser in anything. But because the world had already decided, before she could form words, that the seat at the head of the table was taken. What makes this story worth telling is that Lee did not accept that. Not at first. Not for a long time. The women who knew her in the early 1960s described Lee in terms that stopped rooms. Dark, wide-set eyes. High cheekbones that photograph. Furs competed over. A voice. Husky, low, with a musicality that made people lean toward her when she spoke. And a wit that was, by every documented account, sharper than her sister's. Faster than almost anyone in any room she entered. Andy Warhol actively sought her company. Rudolf Nureyev, who could have chosen anyone across 2 continents, spent long private afternoons alone with her at the Radziwill country house in Buckinghamshire. And Truman Capote, who collected extraordinary women the way other men collect first editions, looked at his entire dazzling circle of socialite swans and called Lee the most unconventional one. His highest compliment, reserved for her. She was not Jackie's shadow. Not yet. She was also not naive about the world she had been handed. She had grown up in a household where the education arrived over tea. Their mother, Janet Lee, precise, ferocious, socially ruthless, would pose a question to her daughters. Do you know the secret to happily ever after? The answer, according to multiple biographies, never changed: money and power. Delivered without irony. Not a warning. A syllabus. Both girls memorized it. Both girls married according to it. And both girls discovered, in different ways, that the syllabus contained a footnote nobody mentioned. That money and power were most accessible by attaching yourself to someone who already possessed them. And that once you did, the question of what you wanted separately, distinctly, as a person with an interior life, became very difficult for anyone around you to hear. Lee married first. In 1952, at 20 years old, 5 months before Jackie married John F. Kennedy, she married Michael Canfield, the adopted son of a prominent publishing executive. She was, she told T magazine decades later, deliriously happy for a while. London, a townhouse in Chester Square, a social world that moved like music through the best rooms in Europe. Then she came home one afternoon and could not open the front door. He was passed out against it from the inside. He drank seriously. The marriage ended quietly, the way Lee ended most things that required her to acknowledge pain. Without a scene, with her face composed, moving forward. She was 26 when she divorced. In 1959, she married Stanislaw Radziwill, a Polish nobleman who had become a British citizen. The title of princess was technically disputed. Stanislaw had relinquished it upon naturalization. Lee ignored this completely and instructed every journalist she encountered to use it anyway. She was right to do so. The title was not vanity. It was survival. It was the designation that allowed her to enter rooms without being introduced exclusively as Jackie Kennedy's sister. So she became Princess Lee Radziwill, a princess while her sister was a senator's wife. Then, in 1961, the senator's wife became the First Lady of the United States, and the calculation changed entirely and permanently. She was present for all of it. She was with President Kennedy on his 1961 European tour. She was a frequent guest at the White House. She helped Jackie select the wardrobe for the Paris trip that made Jackie a global icon. She was in the room for the icon making. She helped choose the clothes. She was, as she was in so many moments of this period, the person who made something magnificent possible for someone else. She told Gloria Steinem years later, in a McCall's interview, that her life during the Kennedy years had been empty, cold, and not true. Those words are worth sitting with. She did not say difficult, or overshadowed, or lonely. She chose empty, cold, not true, as if the life she was living was a performance she had not auditioned for, running in a theater she had not chosen, to an audience who applauded the wrong woman at the end of every act. In 1962, something appeared to shift. She met Aristotle Onassis. She began spending real time with him, extended time, the kind that generates specific gossip in tea. What continents? She traveled with him. In August 1963, they attended the opening of the Athens Hilton together. The coverage was not subtle. For the first time in years, Lee was the subject of a story that had nothing to do with Jackie. What she felt during this period, what she believed she had finally found, is visible in the record only through the intensity of what it cost her to lose it. You do not weep to Truman Capote the way Lee reportedly wept in October 1968 unless the thing being announced has occupied the interior of your life for years. You do not call a friend in tears over the loss of something casual. The grief was proportional to the love, and the love had been real and present and unasked about from the beginning. She waited for someone to ask what it meant to her, what this man was, what she was building with him, what she believed the future looked like. Nobody asked. The question formed in the silence where asking should have been, and then the silence held it there, unanswered, unacknowledged, for the rest of her life. She understood for the first time that nobody was going to ask. Not ever. The silence held. Another year. The cost compounded. Aristotle Onassis was 56 years old when Lee came into his life. He was, by any serious measure, the most powerful private citizen most people had ever been near. Not powerful in the inherited way. In the built way, the way that makes inherited power look borrowed by comparison. He had come from nothing. A Greek refugee family in Smyrna, tobacco trading in Buenos Aires, a shipping empire assembled vessel by vessel until his fleet was among the largest privately held in the world. He owned an airline. He owned a private island, Scorpios, in the Ionian Sea, that he had purchased and developed as a personal kingdom. He owned a yacht called the Christina whose decor was a deliberate statement of excess. Barstools upholstered in whale foreskin, floors inlaid with lapis lazuli, a swimming pool that could be hydraulically raised to become a dance floor. This was not wealth as inheritance. This was wealth as argument. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. Broad, dark, built for permanence. His attraction was in his certainty, the quality, specific and unmistakable, of a man who has never once walked into a room and wondered whether he was welcome. He told friends he was drawn to Lee because she was a sad and lonely little creature. Whether this framing was affection or strategy, and whether those two things were ever truly separable in Onassis, is a question that was never publicly examined by anyone positioned to examine it. What is documented is that by 1962, Lee and Onassis were together in ways the entire social world of Europe and America understood. Robert Kennedy, serving as Attorney General, acutely alert to anything touching the Kennedy name, reportedly described Lee's relationship with Onassis as a betrayal of the whole family. He did not sit down with Lee and ask what the relationship meant to her. He rendered a verdict, stated it to the people around him, and considered the matter addressed. The silence was not accidental. It had been built, carefully, over years. What Onassis required from the silence was simple. He needed no single relationship formally defined. He had Maria Callas, the most celebrated soprano alive, his companion of many years, the woman who had organized her career and her emotional life around the rhythms of his availability. He had Lee. He had proximity to the Kennedy White House through Lee's connection to her brother-in-law. He was also, simultaneously, the subject of a United States government fraud investigation that made his association with the presidential family politically complicated. He had options and he had reasons. The moment anyone asked Lee directly, "What are you to him? What does he intend? What do you believe this is?" the geometry of his life became inconvenient. So no one asked. Not because they couldn't see it, because they could see that asking would force an answer. And then August 1963. Jackie Kennedy had just lost her third child, Patrick, born prematurely, dead within 36 hours. The First Lady was in a grief that the White House could see and was anxious to manage. It was Lee who proposed the solution, a recuperative cruise on the Christina, among people who were warm and wealthy and insulated from everything Washington. Lee extended the invitation. Lee arranged it. Lee was present for the entire voyage. No published account exists from that cruise of anyone asking Lee what she observed, what she noticed, what she understood, watching the space between her sister and the man she believed was hers, about what was being settled in the Aegean light. President Kennedy agreed to the trip under conditions. He insisted Commerce Secretary Franklin Roosevelt Jr. and his wife join the party as a kind of official presence. Roosevelt found the assignment beneath his office and was privately annoyed. Kennedy wanted witnesses. Witnesses to what is a question nobody thought to ask. By the end of that cruise, something had begun between Jackie and Onassis that would continue for 5 years, and end in a marriage that Lee would learn about not from her sister, but from a phone call he made on Jackie's behalf. The silence protected Onassis, protected Jackie. It protected the agreed version of events, the one in which Lee was simply a generous sister, a gracious arranger, a woman who made beautiful things possible for people she loved. What it protected them from was the simpler and more devastating version, that they had watched Lee's feelings in real time and chose, jointly, to leave them unaddressed. The question that grew in the space where asking should have been was not complicated. It was, what do you want? Not what your husband expects, not what your sister requires, not what Onassis intends or the White House needs or your mother trained you to perform. What do you, Lee Radziwill, one of the sharpest and most beautiful women of her generation, want from this one life? Nobody asked it, and what grew in that silence had a specific, identifiable texture. I have read every account of this woman's life, every biography, every interview, every remembrance written by people who moved through the same rooms. Nobody asked the question. I don't know why. I am asking it now. What grew in the unasked space was a particular kind of performance. Not cynical performance, not calculation costumed as warmth, but the real kind. The kind that emerges when a person of genuine depth and genuine intelligence spends years in an arrangement that requires her to be decorative rather than true. You become so expert at the surface that the surface begins to feel like substance. You decorate the inside of your life the way you decorate a room, choosing what is visible, controlling what is felt, making the space beautiful enough that no one asks what you removed to make it look this way. Lee decorated. Obsessively. She became one of the most admired interior designers of her generation. Her spaces architectural in their precision, structured by someone who understood the relationship between form and feeling at a level that professionals in the field recognized and respected. She wrote for Ladies' Home Journal. She befriended Andy Warhol, who understood better than anyone alive what it meant to make a surface so perfect the surface becomes the subject. She went on the Rolling Stones' 1972 American tour with Capote. She showed up in every room that required it, with the specific radiance of someone who had spent decades learning to enter a room and be only what the room needed. And she tried once to break through the performance entirely. Truman Capote believed in something beyond the performance. He had seen what was underneath it or claimed to, and he cast her as the lead in a stage production of the Philaude. Lafayette's story in 1967. She rehearsed. She prepared. She stood in front of a live audience, without the protection of beauty or title or famous proximity, and tried to be seen as a specific character with a specific story. Not Jackie Kennedy's sister. Not Princess Radziwill. Not Capote's most unconventional swan. Someone else. Someone she had chosen. The reviews were unkind. On opening night, Jackie did not come. No explanation exists in the public record. No conversation documented. The seat was empty and the performance continued, and Lee went home that night carrying the specific weight of having tried to be visible in the way that required someone to look directly at her, and being met with an absence. She did not pursue the stage after this. The path wasn't closed by failure. It was closed by the silence of being unwatched by the one person who could have made the watching matter. The silence had a shape by then. It sat at the table with them at every dinner. It was present in every room she entered. Rudolf Nureyev remained genuinely, specifically close to her through this period, midnight window shopping after his performances, long private afternoons at her country house, an intimacy that Lee's biographers treated as singular and real. His own biographer noted that there was a time when Nureyev was very much closer to Lee, and that Jackie envied the bond. And then the pull shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, just the familiar, quiet gravitational drift. Slightly toward Jackie, the way everything in Lee's world had a habit of drifting. She stopped expecting anyone to ask what she needed long before Onassis married her sister. That was the year she stopped. The year she stood on the deck of the Christina and arranged her face into something appropriate and understood that no one was going to ask what the expression was costing her to maintain. The next year of silence produced something the previous year hadn't. The counting begins in October 1968. That is the year the unasked question moved from being possibly askable to being something that could only be answered at a cost Lee had never been asked to consent to. Aristotle Onassis married Jackie Kennedy on October 20, 1968, on Scorpios. Lee was not at the ceremony. In the first year after that marriage, Lee still had the structural architecture of her own life intact. She was still Princess Radziwill, still sought by Warhol, still centered by Capote, still one of the women whose presence made rooms complete. Her marriage to Stanislav was fraying. It would dissolve formally in 1974, but it still provided the external appearance of an organized life. What the first year took from her was the simpler and more total thing, the possibility of straightforwardness. She could no longer walk into a room without every person present holding knowledge, behind their eyes, behind their composure, that the man she had loved had married her sister. She had to perform, from that point forward, the specific role of a woman who had not been publicly and permanently betrayed. That performance cost something every day. It is not free to maintain. And nobody asked whether she was paying. The silence held. The cost compounded. The middle years, when silence becomes structure. By the early 1970s, the silence had normalized so completely that its weight became invisible, even to people who were watching. This is what happens when a wound goes long enough without acknowledgement. It stops looking like a wound and starts looking like character. She built things that were genuine and serious. Interior design became a real discipline, clients, a reputation, a visual intelligence that professionals respected. She made rooms beautiful. She became expert in the construction of environments in which people felt exactly what she chose for them to feel. Sit with that for a moment. A woman who spent decades in rooms where no one asked what she was feeling, becoming the person who controlled everyone around her felt. That is not coincidence. That is the architecture of someone who found the one domain where she could answer the unasked question on her own terms, without requiring anyone else to ask it first. Adapting to the silence cost something that was invisible in the adaptation itself. The way a person who has learned to compensate for a limp no longer seems to limp, but has used muscles for the compensation that were meant for something else entirely. She was good at this. She was so good at this that the compensation looked like talent, and in some ways it was. But it was talent purchased at a price nobody ever calculated out loud. The year she almost asked, 1978. Truman Capote betrayed her in 1978, in a way that was public, deliberate, and precise in the way that only truly brilliant people manage when they are wounded. He had become entangled in a lawsuit with Gore Vidal and needed Lee to testify on his behalf. She declined. She would not insert herself into a legal war between two men whose conflict had nothing to do with her. Capote, in response, gave an interview in which he disclosed things Lee had told him privately. Things she had said in the hours when the performance was down. Things that belonged to the sealed interior of genuine friendship. She was furious. More furious than anything in her documented adult life suggests she had previously allowed herself to be. And this is important because what Capote had done was not only a betrayal of confidence. It was a demonstration, in public, of something she had been circling for years without naming. That the people who claimed to see her most clearly had a consistent habit of using what they saw for purposes of their own. Onassis had used her access to the Kennedys. Jackie had used Lee's introduction to Onassis. And now Capote, who understood better than anyone the specific weight of being second, who had looked at her and seen his own reflection, used her interior life as currency. In a dispute she had refused to enter. She came closer in 1978 to asking the full question than she ever had. The anger was the shape the question takes before it becomes a question. Specific, directed, ready. She crossed the threshold of expressed fury. The silence absorbed it. She forgave him eventually. She always forgave. And the threshold moved further than it had ever been. The final years, what cannot be undone. Jackie Kennedy died May 19, 1994. Lee was at her side. She wept, by every account inconsolably, the grief of someone who had loved, across a lifetime of irresolution, without ever arriving at the question that might have resolved it. Then the will was read. Jackie had left bequests to friends, to employees, to every category of person who had been significant in her life. The document ran 38 pages. To Lee, to the sister who had introduced her to Onassis, who had been in Washington when Kennedy was shot, who had stood beside her through every public loss. Jackie left nothing. The clause read, "I have made no provision in this my will for my sister, Lee B. Radziwill, for whom I have great affection, because I have already done so during my lifetime." 14 words doing 30 years of work. For whom I have great affection. Present tense. As if affection were a financial instrument. As if the accumulated history, the yacht, the phone call, the opening night no-show, the will itself, could be discharged by the word affection placed into a legal document that Lee could not respond to, argue with, or ask about directly, because the person who wrote it was already gone. Nobody had asked Jackie, before she died, whether she knew what she had taken from her sister. Nobody asked Lee, after the will, what the clause about affection meant to a woman who had spent 30 years being compensated in the currency of affection rather than acknowledgement. The papers reported it. Biographers noted the irony. But the question beneath the accounting he won Lee had been carrying since 1963, remained untouched. The silence had cost her everything it was possible to cost someone who had never been asked a single direct question. And then it made the cost permanent by removing the person who could have been asked to answer for it. 7 years after Jackie died, Lee published Happy Times, a memoir, her photographs, her words. The title is the entire story in 2 words. Not true things. Not the cost of it. Not what I saw from the deck. She named it Happy Times, and filled it with beauty and warmth and the pleasure of having been loved by extraordinary people in extraordinary places. She described her strongest bond with Jackie as a shared sense of humor. Those are precise words chosen by a precise woman. To cross the threshold of writing her own memoir, Lee had to make one specific sacrifice. She had to write the safe version, the composed version, the version in which the life she had lived was beautiful rather than costly, in which the people who had shaped it were regarded with warmth rather than examined with the honesty she was capable of. She handed the reader a surface. What happened when she crossed that threshold confirmed the pattern. People read Happy Times and discussed what it revealed about Jackie. Lee's memoir about Lee's own life was reviewed with Jackie's name in the opening paragraph. The silence absorbed the attempt so completely that her memoir became source material for other people's stories about her sister. The threshold moved further. Capote believed in what was underneath Lee's performance and pushed her toward a vehicle that would require it to be seen directly. He cast her as the lead in the Philadelphia story in 1967. She rehearsed. She prepared. She stood before a live audience as a specific character with a specific story. Not Lee Radziwill, not the princess, not Capote's swan. Someone she had chosen to inhabit. The critics were not kind. That part is documented and well known. W.H. At his less examined is this: Jackie was not there on opening night. The one person whose attendance would have meant I see you as separate from me, as someone with something of your own worth watching, was absent. No explanation. No conversation about the absence. Just the empty seat and the reviews and the specific loneliness of having tried to be visible in the way that required someone to look directly at you, and being answered with nothing. She did not seriously pursue the stage after this. Not because of the reviews. Because of the silence of that empty seat. After 1994, with Jackie gone and the relationship between them now permanently sealed into the past, Lee gave interviews that moved, carefully measurably, toward the edge of the full question. She told Vanity Fair that the idea Jackie had asked her permission before pursuing Onassis was absolute nonsense. She confirmed she had made the introduction. She confirmed that she had not heard about the engagement from her sister, that Onassis had been the one to call her. For a woman who had maintained composed public silence across decades of provocation, these were significant admissions. They were the closest she had come to standing at the wound and naming its origin. But she stopped there. Every time, the sentence would build toward the full question and then redirect, soften, arrive somewhere more manageable than where it was heading. She confirmed the wound existed. She could not ask why nobody had ever asked who made it. What this cost her permanently was the relief of complete truth. She had gotten close enough to the question to make it visible from the outside, and not close enough to speak it aloud in a form that required an answer, which is its own kind of imprisonment. No longer silent, not yet free. The question Lee formed completely, had every word of, and never spoke was this: did Jackie choose Onassis knowing exactly what she was taking? Not in the disorientation of grief. Not swept along by comfort and proximity and the particular seductiveness of a man like Onassis in a beautiful place, but deliberately, with full awareness that Lee had loved him, arranged their meeting, stayed in a marriage she called empty and cold partly to protect the political reputation of a White House she had been quietly serving. Did Jackie choose him knowing what it would cost Lee? The evidence for this question was fully assembled in the record. Jackie had not called. She had sent him to call. The will had excluded Lee while framing the exclusion as an act of prior generosity. A lifetime of small choices, each defensible in isolation, that accumulated into a pattern too consistent to be accidental. Lee had every word of this question. She never crossed the final threshold to speak it. Not in print. Not to Capote. Not in the memoir. Not in the interviews. Not in the 25 years she outlived Jackie, when the only cost of asking would have been the discomfort of the truth itself. The last threshold was not crossed. She stood at it for years. She never moved. And what waited on the other side, unasked, unanswered, forever, became the heaviest thing she ever carried. Lee Radziwill died February 15, 2019, in her New York City home. 85 years old. Natural causes. Her daughter Anna Christina confirmed it to the New York Times. The Times ran an obituary by Robert D. McFadden. The opening line described her as the socialite younger sister of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Not one of the great style architects of the 20th century. Not the woman Truman Capote considered irreplaceable. Not the interior designer whose spaces redefined elegance, or the woman Rudolf Nureyev chose for his midnight hours, or the person who shaped the 1961 Paris wardrobe that made Jackie Kennedy a global phenomenon. Not even the woman who introduced Aristotle Onassis to the woman he married. The socialite younger sister. Friends of Lee's reportedly circulated that obituary as evidence, as the final document in a case that had been building across 8 decades and was never formally tried, as proof that the silence had won, completely, finally, and in print. One memorial written in her honor addressed the Times line with a single phrase that circulated among people who had known her: "We are looking at you, Robert D. McFadden." Said with the exasperation of people who had watched a woman be described by the wrong noun for 60 years, and then watched it happen one last time in her own death notice. Now returned to October 1968. The phone call. Lee lifting the receiver. Hearing his voice. Understanding in the first second what the call was. You understand now what was in that moment in a way you could not have understood at the beginning of this story. You understand that Lee had been with Onassis since 1962. That she had stayed in a marriage she described as empty and cold partly to protect the White House while her brother-in-law was president. That she had arranged the cruise in 1963, made the introduction, stood on that boat watching what began. That she had spent 5 years watching without being asked what she saw. That when the engagement happened, it was announced to her by him and not by her sister. That when her sister died, the 38-page accounting of her life contained a clause about affection and Lee's name attached to nothing. The question that should have been asked in 1962 on the boat in 1963, in 1968 when she wept to Capote, in 1978 when Capote betrayed her, in 1994 when she read the will was not complicated. It was this: what is this costing Lee? Nobody asked it. Not the lawyers. Not the family. Not the journalists who chronicled the Kennedys with a thoroughness that extended to footnotes. Not Capote, who saw her more clearly than almost anyone and used what he saw. Not the people who were in all the same rooms and knew all the same things and maintained, in their silence, the arrangement that required Lee's cost to go unexamined. And once she was gone, the question could still be asked. But not of her. Her answer, in her own voice, with her own precision, in the specific low musical cadence that made people lean toward her when she spoke, is gone. Not misplaced, taken, by the same silence that shaped her living, made permanent by a line in an obituary that placed her sister's name before her own in the record of her own death. She outlived Jackie by 25 years. 25 years to be simply Lee. To be the woman without the context of her sister pressing on every side. And still, in death, in print, in the permanent sentence, she was the younger sister first. This is the question that was never asked of Lee Radziwill while she was alive. It is being asked here, out loud, completely, for the first time. The question: Lee Radziwill, you were born 18 months after your sister and spent 85 years described in relation to her. You married a prince while she married a senator who became president. You were present for the White House years, for the Paris wardrobe, for the state visits and the family Christmases in Palm Beach. And you described all of it privately to Gloria Steinem as empty, cold, and not true. In 1962, you began a relationship with Aristotle Onassis, one of the wealthiest men alive. You traveled with him openly. You attended public events together. In August 1963, when your sister was mourning her premature infant, you arranged for her to board his yacht. You made the introduction. You were on the Christina for the duration of that cruise. You watched what began between them. You said nothing. You stayed in your marriage for years partly, according to multiple biographical accounts, because leaving would have embarrassed the White House. You gave interviews after Jackie's death in which you confirmed, precisely, that she had not informed you of the engagement, that you heard it from Onassis himself. You published a memoir about your own life and named it Happy Times. You lived 85 years, outlived your sister by 25, and died described in every major obituary as her younger sibling. Did any person, any man, any friend, any journalist, any member of the family who moved through all of these events, ever once sit down with you and ask directly, what did all of this cost you? The answer: no. The record does not contain it. Not one documented conversation. Not one published account from a person who was in the rooms with her in which that question was asked and answered. Not one interview in which a journalist set aside the question of what Lee revealed about Jackie and asked, instead, what Lee revealed about Lee. Not Onassis, who knew what she had given up and called her a sad and lonely little creature. Not Jackie, who wrote a will that described 3 decades of irresolvable history as something she had already settled during her lifetime. Not Capote, who looked at Lee and saw his own reflection and used both for his own purposes. Not Nureyev, not Warhol, not the biographers who wrote about her in chapters bracketed by her sister's name. Nobody asked. The answer to what it cost her is in what she produced. A memoir named Happy Times, by a woman whose precision with language was exact and deliberate. She did not name it Easy Times or Good Times or simply My Life. She chose Happy Times, the word that people use when they have agreed, at a cost they prefer not to discuss, to describe something as better than it was. The word that holds a surface in place with both hands. The word that smiles. The answer is in Capote calling her his most unconventional swan. She was unconventional, the word implies, because she refused to perform gratitude for the position she had been assigned. She knew what she had built. She knew what had been taken from it. And she carried both the knowledge of the building and the knowledge of the taking, across a lifetime in which no one offered to relieve her of either. Not by asking the question, not by waiting for the answer, not by staying in the discomfort of her interior long enough to hear what it actually held. The answer is in what her daughter said the day she died. Natural causes. The smallest, most neutral words in the language. A life completed. Not interrupted. Not taken. Completed. At 85, having outlived the sister in whose shadow every obituary was going to place her regardless, because the shadow had been the agreed structure for 60 years and structures outlast the people who build them. Lee Radziwill was not Jackie Kennedy's little sister. She was the woman who made the introduction that shaped the most famous second marriage of the 20th century, and received, for it, a clause about affection in a will she couldn't contest. She was the woman who loved a man who ultimately chose the room her sister walked into. She was the woman who stood on a yacht in the Aegean and watched her own future rearrange itself and arranged her face into something appropriate and said nothing out loud. She was Capote's most unconventional swan. She was Nureyev's midnight companion. She was Warhol's sought-after friend. She was, by any honest accounting, one of the most remarkable women of her generation, and she spent that generation being asked, in every room she entered, what it was like to be near her sister. She wanted, simply and completely, to be the one he chose. She was not, and nobody, not once, not across 60 years of proximity to the whole of it, asked what that silence cost the woman who had built it for everyone else's benefit but her own. Nobody asked. She wanted to be chosen. She spent a lifetime choosing for someone else. Old money wives. The silence ends here.